I never thought a doctor's appointment could change the way I looked at myself. It started on an overcast Tuesday, the kind of day when the clouds sit low and make everything feel heavier. My migraines had been getting worse, sharp pulses behind my eyes, almost like my body was trying to send me a message I couldn't decipher. My friend Sanaa insisted I visit a senior neurologist she'd seen before, a man known not just for his skill, but his unusual way of making patients feel seen. His name was Dr. Hasib. I didn't expect much. I'd been to enough hospitals to know how cold and mechanical they could feel. But the moment I stepped into his office, something shifted. He stood as I entered, offering a small smile that barely moved his lips but warmed the air in the room. Mid-50s, tall, silver hair with flecks of black still holding on. His eyes were kind, sharp, observant, but not piercing. They seemed to carry stories, the kind that don't rush to be told. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, and as I sat down, my throat tightened. I tried to speak, to explain the pain, but I found myself distracted. Not by how handsome he was, though he was in an effortless, aging nobly sort of way, but by how his presence made me feel suddenly smaller and seen at the same time. I caught myself staring at his hands as he wrote notes. They moved with practiced grace, as if they knew the rhythm of healing. And then, embarrassingly, I realized my mouth had started to water. It wasn't physical attraction alone. It was deeper. It was like my soul, starved for tenderness, had found a place to rest, even if just for a few minutes. I blinked fast, trying to pull myself together. He listened carefully, asked the right questions. Not just about my headaches, but about my sleep, my stress, my emotional state. No one had asked me that in a long time, not even the man I had loved for years, who'd left without warning 6 months ago. I think your body is carrying more than it can hold, Dr. Hasib said gently. It's asking you to let go. I nodded, unsure whether to thank him or cry. The appointment ended too soon. As I walked out of the clinic, the weight of what just happened pressed on me. It wasn't a diagnosis I walked away with, it was the beginning of something unspoken, unexplored, and completely unexpected. I told myself I'd come back for a follow-up, that the migraines needed monitoring. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the reason. Some part of me had already started writing a story I wasn't sure I should be part of. And yet, I couldn't wait to turn the next page. I returned to Dr. Hasib's clinic a week later, though the migraines had started to fade. I told myself I was being proactive about my health, but deep down I knew I was chasing something else, something intangible. He greeted me with that same composed warmth, his eyes scanning my face with quiet concern. "How's the pain?" he asked. "Manageable," I said. But I thought I should check in, just in case. He didn't question my reason. Instead, he offered me a seat and asked about my routine, my stress levels, my sleep. I answered, but I found myself watching the way he leaned forward when I spoke, how he nodded as if each word mattered. Over the next few weeks, I found excuses to keep coming back. Sometimes it was a new symptom. Other times I claimed the medication made me drowsy, or the headaches returned in different patterns. He never rushed me. Each session blurred the line between consultation and conversation. Slowly, the discussions became more personal. One afternoon, while the clinic was quiet, I asked him if he ever got tired, listening to people's pain all day. He smiled, almost wistfully. "I lost my wife 5 years ago," he said, his voice even. "After that, I understood pain on a different level. Helping others, it's how I breathe now." I didn't know what to say. The room felt heavier, and yet more intimate. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was a man with a history, a heart still healing. In that moment, I saw not just wisdom in his eyes, but sorrow too. A familiar kind of loneliness. We began to talk longer after each session. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, even the things I'd stopped thinking about. And I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone before. I told him about my ex, how he'd grown distant, how I kept waiting for something to change until it didn't. "People don't always leave suddenly," Dr. Hasib said once. "They begin to disappear long before the door closes." Those words stayed with me. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Rain pelted the clinic windows, and the lights flickered before going out for a brief moment. We sat there in near darkness, only the glow from his desk lamp backup battery casting soft shadows. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was electric, unspoken, fragile. When the lights returned, I realized I'd been holding my breath. He didn't move. Neither did I. The moment passed, but it left a mark. That night, I lay in bed thinking of him, not as a doctor, but as a man I felt drawn to in a way I couldn't explain. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, but somehow I didn't want to turn back. Somehow, he had become the brightest part of my week. The decision to tell him how I felt wasn't sudden. It had been building slowly, like the anticipation before a long-held breath is released. After weeks of shared silences, lingering glances, and quiet conversations that drifted well beyond the bounds of a patient-doctor relationship, I was convinced there was something real between us. Something neither of us had dared to name. I spent an entire weekend preparing. I wrote a short letter, simple, honest, folded it 3 times, and tucked it into my purse. I told myself that even if he didn't feel the same, at least I'd find clarity. Closure, maybe. The clinic was unusually busy that Monday. I waited for over 30 minutes, heart pounding with each tick of the clock. When the receptionist finally called my name, I stood quickly, trying to keep my composure. As I turned the hallway corner, I froze. There he was, Dr. Hasib, standing just outside his office door. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, mid-40s, elegant in a pale blue scarf. Her hand was casually resting on his arm. Beside them were 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, laughing about something. The girl called him Baba with ease, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. My world stilled. The hallway noise blurred, voices dimmed, and all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. I stepped back before anyone saw me and sank into a nearby chair. He wasn't just kind. He wasn't just a doctor. He was engaged. A father. A man with a whole life I knew nothing about. Suddenly, every moment we'd shared felt tainted, like I'd been walking through a dream built entirely in my own mind. Had I imagined the closeness? Had I mistaken professionalism for affection? Or worse, had he known and allowed it? He passed me minutes later, alone this time. "Sorry for the wait," he said, opening his office door. I followed him inside, unable to meet his eyes. He spoke as usual, checking in on my symptoms, making small talk. Nothing was different in his voice, but everything was different in me. I didn't mention the letter. I didn't speak of feelings. I nodded, answered his questions, smiled when necessary. When the session ended, I stood and paused. "I won't be needing another appointment," I said, keeping my tone neutral. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in his gaze. "All right," he replied. At the front desk, I scribbled a short note and left it with the receptionist. It read, "Thank you for seeing me, even if it wasn't what I thought it was." Then I walked out, my heart cracking under the weight of a fantasy I had built with my own hands. I didn't cry until I got home. And even then, it wasn't just sadness, it was shame. Because in the end, I hadn't been betrayed by him. I had been betrayed by my own hope. In the days that followed, I avoided mirrors. It was easier not to confront the version of myself who had believed in something that never truly existed. But pain, like water, finds its own way of seeping through the cracks, and eventually, I had to face it. I stopped talking about Dr. Hasib. When Sana asked how my appointments were going, I smiled and said, "Better now," leaving no space for questions. It wasn't a lie, I was getting better. Not in the way I'd expected, but in the way life often demands, through heartbreak, reflection, and quiet surrender. A month later, I joined a women's wellness group focused on journaling and emotional recovery. At first, I barely spoke. But then one afternoon, during a writing session titled Unspoken Chapters, I wrote our story. I didn't name him. I didn't have to. I poured everything into those pages. The hope, the tension, the silent goodbyes, and the heavy clarity that followed. I posted the piece on a storytelling platform under a pseudonym. I didn't expect it to resonate. But within a week, the post had thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. Strangers wrote about their own silent loves, about misread kindness, and the ache of unreciprocated connection. For the first time, I didn't feel foolish. I felt human. Healing didn't happen in grand moments. It came in the small ones. A cup of tea sipped slowly. A morning walk where the air didn't feel so heavy. A laugh that came from deep in the belly instead of forced from the lips. Piece by piece, I was building a version of myself that no longer needed someone else's gaze to feel seen. Sometimes I passed by the clinic. I never went in, but I'd pause for a moment outside the gate. Not to linger in the past, but to remind myself of what I'd learned, that not all connections are meant to bloom into something lasting. Some arrive only to awaken something asleep within us. One evening, while scrolling through messages on the storytelling app, I noticed a comment on my post from an anonymous user. It simply read, "You taught me something too." No name, no hint of identity. But I knew. I hovered over the reply button, heart fluttering. But then let it be. Some chapters are better left closed. Months have passed now. I don't dream of him anymore. But I don't resent him either. He didn't break me. He reminded me I could still feel, still hope, still love, even if it was misplaced. And in a quiet way, that was enough. Because sometimes, the people who stir your soul aren't meant to stay. They're only meant to show you that it still exists. And for that, I will always be grateful.